You are.
That took so long.
I know, I need to have some quick button.
It's on the home page.
I'll see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's right there on the home page. That took an insanely long time. Do you want to hold it?
Yeah,
For
the
comfort?
sound needs to be good. Just ignore it, continue.
No, I was just thinking that it links to what you were saying just now. What were you saying about the middle?
Oh, so I dreamed that of a text saying from I to we to something in the middle. Or from 1 to 9 to 6.
From I to we is the same thing as what Alan Watts was talking about. Of Atman to no Atman, to Anatman. And then there being the middle way, that both are true in a sense, and neither is true in a sense. Because I is Atman, the self. Anatman means no self. But in some sense, what you're saying is more not Atman to Anatman. What you're saying is more analogous to Atman, and Brahman. Brahman is we, in a sense, but in some sense it's not, it's unity. And Atman is our individual selves. So in some sense, Brahman is the encapsulation of all of ourselves, the divine self, the Godhead. And Atman is our individual selves, which is the I. What the Buddha preached was Anatman. But probably just in pushback to the idea of Atman. He was essentially highlighting the opposite to what is commonly believed. Because a way of teaching is to always highlight what is not being pointed out. That really is the essence of teaching. Is to highlight what's not being already talked about, what's not being pointed out in common culture.
Because the idea was from self to others to in between. Would you say that's similar to what you're saying?
From self to others.
Like as if at first you're focused only on yourself. Like even when you have a development, I think it's one of the stages in childhood now. But at first you're focused on only your needs, and then you start to open up to other people's needs. I remember Freud talking about something like that. And then, so it almost felt like that, like a development from only thinking of the self in a bit of a narcissistic way to opening up to other people's needs. And then bring it back in a balanced middle.
From that point of view, it's interesting too. The point of view I was thinking about for myself was more the Hindu or the Buddhist perspective, where first you realize you're a self, and then you realize that you are just part of the self, and then upon realizing that, you must let it go and realize that, well, you are a self too. It's kind of the idea of enlightenment is to have it, you must work hard. And then when you have it, you must let it go. And when you let it go, that is when you really have it. It's a paradox. But what you're saying makes sense too. And maybe it's just an alternate representation of it. Of, let's say, when you're born to the age of 2, you're an incredibly selfish person. If you can even really call yourself a person yet, because if the word person comes from the Latin persona, which which I believe means that through which the sound travels. It's the mask that performers used to wear to perform. Because we didn't have microphones yet, they had megaphonic mouths built into the masks to project the voice. So persona is the name of that mask that's worn to project the voice. So if person means the persona that you put on, in other words, I guess your ego that's layered over yourself, maybe you don't really have an ego when you're first born. Maybe that needs to be built by you. Or built by something. At first, I guess when you're born, you have this narcissistic quality, essentially because there is no thought of other yet. You're coming to terms with what it means to even experience the world. All you have are your sensations, and even though no one remembers them perfectly, they must be overwhelming. I think that's what the psychologists called the oceanic theory of mind. Oceanic, I'm not entirely sure where it comes from, but it brings to mind something that you're kind of just lost in the ocean of your thoughts. Maybe not even thoughts yet. You're lost in the ocean of sensations. Just everything you experience is everything. And then as you develop past the age of 2, maybe you start to develop your sense of self. Maybe that you could interpret as the formation of your ego. And then as you get more and more socialized as you grow older, assuming you're raised in a typical way, you start to consider what it means to put others on a similar level as yourself. Maybe not exactly the same, but you start to realize, in order to keep playing this game of life, sometimes I need to sacrifice what I want in the moment in the service of others, so that when the time comes that they are able to sacrifice something for others in return, including me, they will do so. So in some sense, it's the learning of the idea of exchange, that you can only buy if other people are selling, but other people will only sell to you if you sell to them some things that they need as well. And then at some point, maybe you go into adulthood and you learn that, well, there needs to be a balance between those things. I think it's only for agreeable people that you focus too much on other people. Some people never do.
Yeah, I can see how this concept of from I to we to a middle plays out in my life, because when I was young, my whole teenager time, I was super selfish, only focused on myself, like really, really selfish. And then when I became kind of adult, I guess I looked like an adult, but I wasn't really one yet, just legally, is when I completely forgot myself and became hyper-focused on helping others. But yeah, forgetting myself in the process, so constantly sacrificing myself. And it's like now I'm learning to be balanced, to focus on myself, but also thinking of others and helping others. But I feel like this concept from my dream goes deeper even, but almost like that's where it starts.
You can interpret it even as a separation from a collective unconscious, if you think of yourself as being starting in this collective superego, and then you separate from it. But then at some point you realize you need to replenish yourself from it too. So you need a connection to it, but you want to maintain your sense of self also. But it's interesting as well that Socrates once thought that when we're first conceived, we are conceived perfectly, and we have full and perfect wisdom of everything we are and everything we could be. And upon birth, we forget all of it, and that life is just the journey towards remembering what we knew at the beginning. So in some sense, he thought that all learning was just a form of remembering. And it's interesting as well, because that oceanic view of mind, that of being lost in sensation, and for a thing to be everything, is what many people strive towards by meditating. So in some sense, it's not a new thing. You're only striving to remember what you knew immediately upon being born. You understood it immediately. You didn't have the words for it yet because you didn't have language. But as soon as you have language, it's interesting that you learn language probably the fastest when you're young. So you pick it up fast, so you can start speaking already probably by the time you're 2. Maybe not that well, but you have this concept of language put into you. And upon gaining the concept of language is when your ego starts forming. So is your ego really just a conceptual construction? It's once you have language to form the world around you, the world is actually just different now. So in returning to the beginning, the way of thinking, well, actually not the way of thinking, the way of experiencing, that is just experience without additional thought. The goal of most meditation is that you're just attempting to return to pre-consciousness before you had language. That's why you don't talk in Buddhism. You try to not attach words to things. You try to just focus on the experience. They used to not even read books. They used to have books in libraries that would rotate on these creaky shelves, and they would just meditate on the sound of the books. It's not even there to be read. Because in some sense what they realize, and this is true, that once you have language, once you start assigning language to something, it ruins what you're trying to do. Because what you're trying to do is go back to the conception of the thing before language comes in. But now, as adults, language is so core to our entire structure of reality that as soon as you think something, you can't help but attach language to it. And you can say that, I don't think in terms of words, I think in terms of pictures. But pictures are just symbols. You're attaching concepts to something all the time. You're never just experiencing the thing itself, unless maybe you're a very experienced meditator and you know how to glimpse it, but you can't be like that all the time. Because to be like that all the time would be to return to birth, essentially, which I don't know if anyone can do that.
So that's why in Vipassana meditation centers you can't speak the entire time. Probably. They're
trying to remove language from things, because as soon as you use language to describe something, you're labeling it. And then you don't see the thing anymore, you only see the label. It's like what Alan Watts said about eating menus. It's like you go into a restaurant and you see this beautiful menu with all these different options and they all look so good. But in order to get the thing itself, you have to give the menu back. But language is like the menu that describes the thing, but how could it possibly be the thing itself? Or like money. That's the common example that Watts used for money.
Yeah, we do use it for the thing.
The money is only for the other things. And people are often sad about giving up the money, even though the purpose of the money was to get the things that you're giving it up for. In some sense, he used this example of let's say a mother is going shopping. She fills up a trolley full of different items, lots of different foods, lots of different ingredients, some treats, some everyday things. And it's like filled to the brim, and she goes to the checkout counter and they scan all of the items, and then the person at the checkout says, okay, it'll be this much, and it's a lot. And the mother, for a split second, is a bit taken aback. She's like, oh my God, I didn't realize it was going to be that much money. I'm going to have to lose that much money. And he says that it's quite funny somehow that it's painful to give up the money. She goes like, it's a bit painful to give up this money for this stuff, but she has all the value right here. She has a trolley full of valuable things. This is the value, but it's painful to give up the thing that doesn't exist for the actual valuable things. The things in the trolley is where the real value is, and it's, he said, being not willing to give up the money for the thing that's actually valuable is, like he said, chewing on a menu or trying to bite your own teeth. Can you do it? Like, can you live that way?
Well, you can, but it's certainly not comfortable.
Yeah.
Well, eating your own teeth probably not, but biting your own teeth. But yeah, I can relate with that.
It's more painful to give up the possibility of something, even if that means getting something real. And language is similar to that in some sense, because language allows us to assign categories to the world, and then we view the world in terms of those categories. But in these meditation centers where you're not allowed to speak, what they're trying to get you to experience is just experience now. Stop putting the labels on the boxes and just look inside the boxes. Because language is like putting the world into boxes. When we say apple, there's a lot of different types of apple, but they're all apples. And
the first thing I thought of was Apple, the company. I'm too conditioned.
Well, they have a lot of types of products, but they're all Apple products. We put things in boxes with our language. For example, even mathematics is the ultimate bookkeeping field. It's very orderly bookkeeping, mathematics. It's, as Poincaré once said, that mathematics is the art of giving different things the same name. Because three what? Doesn't matter. Three, the concept of three anything. 3 whatever you'd like. So anything that can be grouped into 3, or anything that involves the concept of 3, can be put into a box. And there's a lot of overlap between these different boxes. It's like one thing can go into many of these different boxes, but even mathematics itself, the purest form of logic and reason, I guess, is just a categorization system. We put everything in these boxes, and then once we've labeled everything, we have a tendency to see just the boxes with the labels on them. For example, Alan Watts is using an example of he was sitting on a stool. I can't see the video. There was no video. There's only an audio. But I assume he was sitting on a stool, and he said, "What is this? Is it a stool?" And then I assume he turns it upside down. I don't know because there's no video. But then he says, "Well, now it's a bucket. You can put stuff in it." And he says, "And what is it now?" And then he turns it over again and he starts banging on it like a drum. He's very active in his lectures. Very unembarrassed to just be himself. Then he starts banging on it like a drum and he's saying, "Well, now it's a drum." And then he says, "So, was it ever really a stool? What made it a stool? That's what you were using it for. You were sitting on it. That's what made it a stool. And now I'm banging on it like a drum. Now it's a drum because I'm using it for that. I'm using it like a drum." So he says, things aren't really things at all. Things are what they do.
It's kind of like looking at it as just an object with a shape. And then thinking, oh, that shape could be useful as this. And then we just so used to see that shape as a stool. That when we see a stool and not this item with this strange shape.
The language makes it comprehensible. Because without the language, what is it? It's nothing, really, without the language. It could be anything. Without the language, the thing is merely what it's doing. Which is why some languages don't have nouns, or they have fewer nouns. Like, instead of saying it's raining, you could just say raining.
Isn't that like in Asian?
Yeah, many Asian languages are like this. Because what do you mean by it? What's raining? Just raining. You could point outside and say raining. It would be the same thing. But we say it because we attach a lot of nouns to our verbs. We have verbs go with nouns. We very rarely speak with just the verbs or just the nouns. Because we say, well, it's the things that are doing these things, but it's the doing that defines the thing. You sit on it, therefore it's a stool. You're banging on it like a drum. It's making sound like a drum, therefore it's a drum. A thing is defined by what it's doing. So the doing is the thing. The doing is the being. That's why when we say human being, well, what do you mean by your being? Because you're really defined by what you do. Who you are. What do you mean by are?
A human doing?
Yeah, but it's the same thing. A human becoming? What do you mean? Becoming what? What's the difference between becoming something and just a new self instantiating itself every moment? We have these different things happen and we connect them together, and that gives us the illusion of continuity. But what we're really doing is we're just connecting separate moments together.
What about a human happening?
It makes it more spontaneous. That's a lot more Buddhist, I guess. A lot more, or Taoist, that's more Taoist. It's just like nature. That which is so of itself. It just does. It's like Latin as well. You know, the famous thing that Descartes said, which was, I think, therefore I am, which was, in Latin, was just cogito ergo sum. There's no real language for I in that sentence. It's thinking, therefore am. It's just 3 words. Where's the sense of I? That language doesn't really have it. Or maybe it's built into the structure of the language. But you don't need to say it out loud. It's implied. It's interesting that in many ways, meaning is just ascribed to what we already see it doing. It's like psychologically we don't see the world as objects. We see the world as useful things. Like when you see a glass of water, you don't see the glass and then infer that you can drink it. You see drinking thing and then infer that it's a glass of water.
But I guess it does make it processing things faster.
It is. It's almost instinctive. Like the way when you go to grab something, your hand will shape into roughly the width of that thing before you grab it. It's like you're preparing yourself for this interaction. And it's the same where you look at some food and you say, oh, it's an eating thing. And then you identify what the food is. It happens so fast in your brain that you don't recognize the order in which it happens. But you see purpose first, and then you assign language to that purpose and label it, and then you call it by its label. But yeah, that's what language is for. Language is just categorization of things into boxes, but really the real world doesn't. There are no boxes. The boxes are a construct that we use to make communication possible.
In that sense, it kind of makes us like gods in the way that we create things and we give sense to it. We say what it's supposed to be. So if I create a couch, now I'm saying this is a couch. And this is what you use it for. You use it for sitting. Because look, I put this thing here and this thing here. This I created for that reason with this purpose in mind. So it's like, maybe not like God, but like...
Well, in some sense.
Yeah, like a big sense of being a creator, like shaping the world with our ideas and our words.
Well, naming something is like creating something.
Is it related even to a sense of ownership? Like once you give a name and a word, like it becomes part of your world?
It's kind of like admitting something is real. When you name something, that this is a thing that's real. Do you own it? It depends what you mean by own. But you'll become aware of it.
I don't know where I was going with it, but it just came to me.
It means you're aware of it. It's like, for example, in the Bible where Adam creates... not Adam. God creates all the animals, but then he tells Adam to name them. So in some sense, the Bible is saying that, well, we as humans are, some sense, creators of our own respect, because while we didn't physically create the animals, by naming them, we are making them real. Without names, what are these things?
Just a weird creature with a long neck.
You have to describe them without names.
But that still means you need words.
But you are instead just labeling them by their description instead of their name. It is still naming them. It's just the names would be ridiculously long. That thing with a long neck and black feathers and 2 feet and webbed toes. But the names are an encapsulation of a lot of different words put into one. So the naming makes them real in some sense, because if you can't name it, how can you even describe it? And if you can't describe it, how can you even talk about it or know what it is conceptually? There's no concept, really, of a thing without language of some kind.
Would we be more isolated without language? Or less isolated?
I don't think there's any such thing as community without language.
Yeah, I was thinking that too. But at the same time, when I think of, well, like people in the caves, they seemed really... from what we know, I don't know. The imagination I have is that like they are like tribes and they're very like stick together. So it's like they might not have needed language to still be...
Language is just a powerful tool that allows the tribe to grow in size. Maybe a really small tribe could do without language. But actually, what depends what they could do without words. We created words, but they still use language. Even gestures, we call it body language.
That's true.
You'd have to be telepathic to not use language. And actually, that's wrong as well. By being telepathic, you're understanding each other also through language.
Because even animals use language. You can see them talking to each other and saying things and understanding each other.
Sometimes through gestures, not always through sounds.
Yeah.
So the idea of naming something... It reminded me of something else. I don't remember it anymore. One was the idea of Adam naming all the animals. I don't remember what the other thing was anymore. I was considering bringing it up, but I thought you were going somewhere, so I wanted to leave you to finish your thought first.
I don't know where I was going.
I think you finished your thought.
Yeah, I think so.
I thought I would remember, but I don't remember anymore.
No.
I don't remember. But I do remember something else, that when you were saying, can we exist as community without language? I think the reason it's not possible is because every community we have is actually, in a sense, defined by its language.
Yeah, I was thinking about that as well.
Like a community of, let's say, people who play a certain game, they are all playing the same game. They have the same monsters in the game, they have the same weapons in the game, so that game has its own language, and the people in that community are defined by the game's language. And sometimes they develop their own language that's not directly in the game, but it becomes common knowledge. So that if someone else is joining the community, they're like, what does this abbreviation mean? I don't know what this means. And people have to explain it to them, and then they become part of the community when they know the language. Or like mathematicians are defined by the fact that they all use the same language to speak, the language of mathematics. Or philosophers all speak the language of philosophy. And in that sense, that's why communities are communities, because they're inherently exclusionary.
Yeah, I was thinking that when you don't know the language of a particular community, at first you feel a bit excluded, and you have to learn it to integrate it.
Yeah. So the sense of community is actually feeling like you belong somewhere, but in some sense that comes at the price of not belonging other places. Because it's really hard to learn multiple languages very deeply. And maybe for games it's possible. For deeper fields, bigger fields like mathematics and computer science and philosophy and any number of things, learning all of those languages deeply is really hard. And the more the language you know, then the more you fit into that community.
But at least you fit in other communities, I think.
Yeah, because you've given up your time to learn that language over another language. It's the same way, well, it's really hard to fit into another country's culture after you've already been molded by your own. Because that's an even deeper thing than just fields. Like cultural heritage is so vastly more all-encompassing. It captures so many more experiences, not just conceptual ideas, which is what fields are, but it captures the everyday life. How can you live two lives, right? You can partially integrate yourself into a culture, but then it's at the cost of the one you had before, usually.
Yes, because I see people who, like I told you about her. My friend who was Chinese. I mean, she's still Chinese.
Yeah.
But I guess because...
I was Chinese too. And now I'm British.
Yeah.
So, but she's still Chinese.
Like when she was in France, she started to feel really sad because when she would get her mom on the phone, she was starting to struggle to speak Chinese. Even though she only been in France for like 2 years or something, or 3 years. So she was sad that she was losing it. So it's like you have to give up a bit of the previous community to integrate the new one. Even for me, it's harder to speak French now. Like I struggle finding the words.
Not that it's a big problem for you because you didn't want it. Yeah, it's hard to fit into many communities at once. So communities are inherently exclusionary because without any exclusion, there is no community. Now, there's that idea of the Tower of Babel where everyone speaks the same language. But, well, I mean, in the Bible, God, tears the tower asunder and splits people into different areas of the land and almost in quotes, curses them to speak different tongues so they can't understand each other anymore. But really, I guess it's more just a reflection of what's inevitable. A language will always fragment into many sub-languages. Because everyone is different, so no one is going to be able to speak every single language or to know every part of the language. The language will fragment into different parts, and then each of those different parts will in themselves be like different languages to each other.
Well, that's what makes it alive too, the fact it can change. Because people speak it and they can create new things with it. Just like younger people create a lot of new words.
Yeah, new words are being created all the time. It's kind of like that philosophical thought experiment where like something contradicts itself, right? It's like the philosophy of intolerance. Let's say you had a group of people. It was like a committee that was dedicated to proving, well, maybe not to proving, to encouraging tolerance of other people and other ideas and other cultures. But in order to be tolerant means being tolerant with things that disagree with you and being tolerant of things that oppose you. So the very thing that you have will fall apart if you follow its principles exactly. It's one of those self-defeating things. To be tolerant of everyone means being tolerant of the bad things too, and the bad things which are aiming to destroy your idea of tolerance. It's kind of one of those philosophical paradoxes. In order to enforce tolerance, you must develop intolerance to certain people who oppose your view of tolerance. It's like you can't include everyone because you have to include people with contradictory points of view. Yeah, that idea goes deep, and I forgot the philosopher that originally talked about it, but he was from not too long ago. I think maybe just 100 years ago. He came up with that thought experiment.
It's quite an interesting one.
Because what does it really mean to be tolerant? I guess it was a buzzword around that time, and still now. We use different words, but with the same meaning. If you want to be fully accepting of everything, then you must also accept the things that are trying to destroy your point of view.
But then how can your point of view exist if it's being destroyed?
And that's the paradox. People often put this little caveat on the end as if it's an obvious thing. They don't say, we should be accepting of other people. Full stop. Because people, I think, inherently realize that there is a paradox there. Accepting of everything doesn't make sense to people, I guess. So they add this little caveat on the end. And you see it said over the internet and in person so often that you just think it's obvious. But that little thing that they add on the end is not obvious at all what it means. You should be accepting of other people as long as they don't harm other people.
Yeah, because if we don't put... I was thinking when you were saying that, well, probably not murderers though.
Yeah. And we put that little thing on the end, as long as they keep to themselves and are not accepting of other people. Well, what do you mean by harm? It's very hard to define what harm is.
You can harm someone psychologically.
Yeah. You can harm someone with words. You can harm someone with your actions. You can harm someone indirectly by something you did in the past.
Yeah, actually
we all harm people.
Someone at some point, and we will continue. And even then, sometimes you have to harm someone to protect yourself.
So in that case, what do you do?
Yes. Because if you, for example, cut someone from your life, and that means, let's say they were like abusing you, or let's say you were living with someone who was abusing you. So now you cut them off from your life, but it means now they're homeless. So you're technically harming them, but really that's for your own safety. Would that mean that then you're a bad person, that you shouldn't be accepted because you protected yourself? That like we all harm someone.
I think we keep it vague on purpose because we realize it's context dependent. Everything is context dependent. There are very few things that are just true, full stop. Mostly we have a series of true when, true or true if, and then we have this long list of ifs and long lists of whens, and that's why the law is a dialectic process. It's an argument of innocence versus an argument of guilt. And we're trying to find the truth of that context each time. If we just had a bullet point list of what was wrong and what was right, we wouldn't need lawyers. We would just need the list. The lawyers are there to argue as best they can for their point of view, and then we see which point of view comes out as the winner in that context, which is not always correct or not always, let's say, the most fair outcome. But on average, it's more fair than not doing that. It's like saying, because people say this, for example, that like if you're, leave them alone, we should be accepting of people that aren't harming others. But by leaving them alone, well, I guess it's just, we always try to mold people into the societal image of what makes a good society. And it's really impossible to be accepting of everything. You have some no's, but then even those no's have different contexts where they're not no. Like you said, like, okay, do you want to really be accepting of murderers? Okay, probably not. For what reason, though? Usually to protect other people. But yeah, what about people who kill people in self-defense or to protect their family or...
And even then, with murderers, for example, there are some cases where the people do change and do become different and become good people. So if you say, okay, we have to be tolerant of everyone except murderers, well then, but what if the murderer becomes someone who doesn't harm people anymore? Is he bound by his past now? Or are we considering him as a new person? Is he still a murderer or not? So it's like, now do we accept him or not? It's a bit too complex.
The entire field of ethics is extremely complex because it all comes down to what your base assumptions are. What are the axioms of your line of thinking? Because you're saying that, well, the highest good is to protect the community, but what if the highest good was to protect the individual? If the highest good was to protect the individual, then it comes into paradox again, because it's like, then you say, oh yeah, we shouldn't do anything to anyone then. We shouldn't punish anyone because that would be harming them as individuals. But what if those individuals are harming other individuals? So who do you work in service of? It all depends on what you hold highest, I guess.
So maybe when we say we should be accepting of everyone, what we should say is something different.
Well, people usually say we should be accepting of everyone as long as they don't, and then they usually say something like harm other people or push themselves onto other people, or usually it has something to do with them affecting other people in a negative way. So some people will use that argument for like this case of making drugs illegal, for example. They say like certain drugs shouldn't be made illegal. People should be allowed to quote unquote harm themselves with the drugs. It's not harming anyone else. But in some sense, if you're an alcoholic and you're harming yourself, let's say even if you're single, you don't have a family, so you're not like negatively impacting your family in any way. Well, by being an alcoholic, you are still not contributing to your society. So would you consider that a crime also, or something that is not good? Kant had this idea of the categorical imperative, right? Of should you really do something that you wouldn't want everyone else to do? If it's perfectly fine for you to get drunk every day, then why not everyone do that? And then he says, well, actually, if everyone did that, well, that would be a mess. and then he made the argument, as per the categorical imperative, that, well, if you wouldn't want everyone to do it, maybe you shouldn't do it. But it does fall apart a little bit as well, because if you only do things that would be acceptable if everyone did them, you can't do anything. Because, let's say, I study philosophy, and it's okay, because if everyone studied philosophy, it would be fine. Oh yeah, but then you have a bunch of people not studying the other things. And it wouldn't be so fine. So you, by that argument, you can't even really study philosophy. So it's not exactly a fully definable rule either. If you only act in a way that is okay for everyone else to act, then you can't do anything. But I guess maybe you could constrict it down with all these other little caveats. But we always need it's caveats all the way down. You never get to the end. You get longer and longer descriptions of things, and that's why there's this idea in Buddhism that once you... Oh, is it Buddhism or Taoism? It might be Taoism, that you have the law and the spirit of the law. And then I think a king decides to write it down onto a cauldron. I forgot what he wrote it down on. And the Taoist said to him, you shouldn't do that. Because as soon as you write the law down, people will find ways around it. Because you've written it down, now you've made it small. And now this small thing you can step around. But if you make it a more feel-based concept, something that needs to be argued every time, then people's moral judgment will be called on more directly to see if it was right or wrong. Because you see, the way people get away with things that aren't good is because the law is written down and they find loopholes around it. And then you need to shore up those loopholes with even more laws that kind of make it more clear what this law really means. And then people find loopholes around those. And then you write it down, and then eventually the law becomes so long that no one can remember any of it. And that is a part of the problem with record keeping in general. Eventually, all of our jobs will just be to keep records. And we'll have no time to do the actual thing that we were supposed to be keeping records of. Like in a hospital, the bookkeeping is the most important part. Because they don't want to get sued, so they need to keep very immaculate records of exactly what happened with different patients, because if patients are ill and they die because of malpractice, then that's not good. But they need to prove that they're essentially, they did their jobs properly. But because the records have to be so immaculate, they spend most of their time keeping the records instead of treating patients. And eventually, if people keep finding ways around these laws and these written records, we'll have to keep even more and more detailed records until eventually we'll spend all of our time keeping a record of the things that we don't have time to do anymore. So I understand what the Taoist argument was of, as soon as you write something down, people find a way to get around it. But if you keep it almost aloof and more in spirit, then there's really no way around it, because the obstacle's not really there. Like, there's nothing to step around. It's more of an all-encompassing field. But of course that comes with downsides too, because how do you regulate that? It doesn't work in larger societies to not write the law down. But I understand the philosophical argument there. As soon as you write something down, you assign words to it, it becomes smaller.
I guess it's a concept that could work well within families. Because sometimes you see in some TV shows about families, the rules will be written down. So in that sense, it's better to have them not written down.
Maybe the smaller the community is, the easier it is to function without written laws or written rules. Because in some sense, maybe certain things aren't meant to be applied at every level. Like maybe laws work for communities above a certain size, and then they don't for smaller communities. Or like, you can't apply ethics universally. what you would do in a community is not the same as what you would do in a family. Because in a family, actually, you spend an inordinate amount of time on every single person. But you would never be able to do that in a bigger community. Like some people will say, well, you should do what's best for yourself. However, when it's a difference between doing what's best for yourself and doing what's best for your children, people will err on the side of the child because they're more innocent in that respect. And they're your responsibility as well. So nothing is always true. Like doing what's best for you or what's best for your child, it's more honorable to do what's best for your child. But doing what's best for you or some stranger, then maybe you could have an argument over that. Usually it errs on the side of what's best for you.
How do you think you know the answer?
How you know the answer?
Yeah, how do you find if it's better to do what's best for you or for someone else? Because I see in coaching, for example, it's something that happens sometimes. Someone will ask, like they will be in some issue with some other person. And a lot of time it happens with like, if the person is very agreeable and they tend to be a bit self-sacrificing, they will try to do what's best for the other person, forgetting themselves. And they will try to see, like in coaching, they want help with that, to find answers about is it better to do what's best for them or for the other person, and they struggle to find the balance and the answer. So I was wondering, how do you think people can find the answer?
The balance between doing what's best for you and what's best for someone else? That's a very difficult question. It all depends on what you're serving above that. So let's say in a situation where, let's say, you're in a bad relationship and you're doing too much for the other person, there are many reasons why that's bad and many reasons why maybe that's not so bad. Because what's your goal? Is your goal to make that other person as happy as they can be, or to make them as comfortable as they can be? If that's your highest goal, then it's right to do what you're doing and serve them completely. Is your goal to make yourself as fulfilled and happy or as comfortable as you can be? Well, then it's not right to do what you're doing. Is your goal a bit bigger? Like, is it to make sure that as many people in this relationship as possible are functional and capable of helping the wider society? Then in that case, it's probably not the best to do what you're doing either, because you're incapacitating yourself to make someone else comfortable beyond what is necessary for them to function in society. You're basically removing all of their distress. You're making all of their distress your responsibility. So you're incapacitating yourself so that one person can, at some point, function better, but it's like you're taking away yourself to make someone better. Whereas it'd be better if you both just worked at the minimum functional level. So in that sense, you would need to balance if that's what you hold highest. It all depends on what your... So you have this hierarchy of value of things that you find valuable. What's at the top? Whatever's at the top and you want to serve is usually the thing that determines what you do at every other level down. But that's a really hard question to ask as well. That's what people mean by serving the good or, serving God, is what's at the top and serving that at the end of the day. In some sense, people want to simplify their life by having a stimulus response kind of cheat sheet. This stimulus provides this response optimally. This one should have this response optimally. Like when this happens, I should do that. When this happens, I should do that. But if you have a list of things that is basically just telling you when this happens, you have to do this. When this happens, you have to do this. And we had a perfect one, and living according to that would give you a perfect life. You don't need a brain at all. You just need a set of algorithms that follow those rules. Like you don't need to think at all. But the reason we do think is because maybe there is no cheat sheet of what to do in certain situations. It's all about who you serve. Do you serve yourself? Do you serve other people? Do you serve God? And when you say God, what do you mean? Do you serve the good? And if you mean the good, what do you mean? It's interesting because in the end of the day, doesn't it just come down to, it's all feels, man. We don't have enough language to describe everything properly. But feelings precede language. It doesn't mean that they're all right, and what do we even mean by right? But they tell you things that are outside of language sometimes. When someone says, I just have a feeling about something going wrong, or I just have a feeling this is the way to go. This will end up somewhere good. Like, we don't have any language that describes it beyond that. That's all we've got. So maybe there is no way of knowing for sure, but optimizing your experience, I guess, just requires you to know or to pay attention to what a good experience for you is. Because when you're having a good experience, there are no questions. You just know it is a good experience. And when you have a bad experience, you'll have many questions about why is this happening to me? Why this? But you'll know it's bad. You'll know it's bad without needing to put that many words to it. You'll just know, I don't feel good about this. And sometimes when people say that our feelings lead us astray, it's really only in the sense that they lead us astray from what our higher goal was, if you had one, which I think everyone has a higher goal, maybe or not everyone is conscious of it. That everyone is serving something that they hold highest, but maybe we don't know exactly what that is. By paying attention, you can figure out part of the shape of it, but maybe you'll never know the exact form.
Well, maybe it's easier to know your values at least. That kind of guide you.
Values are kind of like axioms. What do you believe in the absence of other things? That's why people say that you should align on values with your partner. It's what you hold highest. Because it means that you won't disagree with each other too often. Well, maybe on smaller things. But it means that if you hold the same thing highest, you're both serving the same thing, which means you'll both have a similar view of what's right and what's wrong. You'll have a similar view of how to act and how not to act. And it will make peace much more achievable. And you want peace in a relationship.
Well, some don't, but...
Well, you want some conflict is good for everyone.
Yeah.
To iron things out, to sharpen each other. But you want a bedrock of peace, probably, with some wrinkles here and there.
If you have a healthy mind, yeah.
So maybe you don't want peace, and it's hard to say that you're wrong as well, other than maybe you will suffer a lot. So I guess to get back to your question, how do you find the balance? That's like asking...
I guess my question was not necessarily balance, but how what would be the way to find the right answer for you? Not for you as a person in general.
Well, how would you find anything, really? Find the right answer for you.
What questions would you ask yourself?
Oh, maybe you'd ask yourself, is this serving what I hold highest? You kind of need to have an idea of certain things that you just hold to be true.
So in a sense, you have to know yourself quite well.
Yeah. Let's say maybe you hold the truth to be highest. Well, then everything that you do should serve the truth. Or if you hold something else higher than something else, you should be consistent with the higher thing. For example, sometimes maybe you need to lie in order to do something that you view as good, in which case your sense of good is the highest. But then that comes down to how you can't really write down what your sense of good is. That really is based mostly on instinct and feeling. Something is instinctively good or bad to most people. So if you want to hold that highest, then you can't really write it down. Feelings lie to you sometimes.
They do.
So it's not an easy question. It's all about what you want to optimize. Do you want to optimize your experience of life, which is, I guess, what most people want to optimize? If you want to optimize your experience of life, you have to say, if I continue down this path or keep doing what I'm doing, will that be okay with me? Will it result in things that are okay with me? Do you want to serve what you want now or what you want later? There's no easy answer, really.
No, I know.
Yeah.
I was curious to see what you would think.
I guess you ask yourself, is it serving what I hold highest? Or what I hold high? Because I think the language of doing things that serve you, I understand what people mean about things that don't serve your purpose are not so good. Things that, or maybe they're not right for you. But I think it implies too much that the service is in one direction. Maybe it's better to say, is this serving the same thing that I serve? Because we're all serving something. When you say you serve me, what do you mean? You today or you tomorrow? Because doing exactly what you want impulsively all the time is serving you today. But it's not serving you tomorrow or next week or next year. It serves them even less and less the further you go out with all the impulsive bad stuff that you do.
So like as an example, let's say you feel really sad, and when you feel really sad, eating something like a cake makes you feel better.
So you're serving yourself. You're making yourself feel better.
Maybe you're serving yourself today because this cake makes you feel better at that moment. But then maybe it's not serving you from 10 years later because all the cake is not good.
Yeah, 10 years later and 3,600 slices of cake later. Which has all just made its way into you now. And now you're more cake than human.
So in a sense, from everything you say, it's like language is so malleable. It's always subjective, but it's not just subjective. It can change because like what's right for me. Well, what is right for me? Who's even me? It's like this. Every word brings more questions. So it's almost like words are malleable and very subjective.
That is, in some sense, the postmodern argument, right? That there's no such thing as meaning inherently in words. Meaning is all interpretation. And in some sense, sure, meaning is what you make of it. But that's assuming that language is everything as well. I think there are some things that are beneath language, that come before language, that we had before language was even a concept. And we still had, I think, a sense of meaning even before language. Maybe more primitive in some sense. But maybe that's what these meditation practices are trying to do, is to get you away from language. Because maybe, there's no way of proving this really, but maybe language is just a mask over what is truly meaningful. It's kind of like those things that no one questions, like music, no one questions it. But what does it mean? You can't really describe it with language. Yeah.
It made me think of, like, for example, you can say to someone, I love you. But the words don't really have a meaning. What the real meaning is the feeling they have. But they could say the exact same words. And they could say it one day with the feeling and it's true. And they could say it one day without the feeling and maybe it's not true. Like, let's say their love died out and they still say it out of habit. So it's like, what's really meaningful is not the words, but what's underneath.
Yeah, the words reflect some deeper truth beneath. And that's what's really important. But it can never be fully captured with words. And sometimes we confuse the words for the thing itself. Like when someone says, I love you, if we choose to believe them, so maybe sometimes we confuse the words with what it means. It's like looking at a box of things, seeing the label on it and saying, oh yeah, that's what it is, but never looking inside the box. Maybe the box is empty. There's nothing there. Or it's got stuff in there that you didn't want or expect.
Like a snake.
Yeah. Like the snake in your heart. Yeah, I think... Because words are malleable to a degree. When you say what's best for me, the malleable word there... Well, actually, there's multiple malleable words there, but one obvious one is what you mean by me. Me over what time frame? Me in what sense? And then, of course, the other malleable word is best. So, when you think too much about language, you start to get caught up in describing what... You're describing descriptors. You get caught up in describing the things that are used to describe things. And then you're totally lost. Like, there's no end to that.
That's how I feel as we talk. I feel like it gets more and more like, I don't know, like less and less tangible. And it's more and more, the more we try to think of language, it's like the more the language escapes.
And then at the end, you just have to conclude, oh, to hell with it, we're ending it here. This is what we mean. We know what we mean. We can't find the language to describe what we mean, but we know what we mean. And then maybe that's the point at which, through frustration, you let go. And that's the idea in Buddhism, that you work hard to get the thing, and then when you have the thing, you let it go. And when you let it go, then you truly have the thing. Maybe that's what it means. Once you get to the point of frustration, it's like, okay, I give up. This is stupid. We're not getting anywhere. We're just... we're finding more and more basements beneath the basement. It doesn't end. And then you realize, do we need to be in the basement at all? Can we not just experience life outside? And then you come back and you realize, I already knew what I wanted to do. Like, you already knew. In some sense, maybe, like, if you view learning as remembering, you really already know. You know, and you're just trying to figure it out. You're trying to figure out what you already knew from the beginning. Because I think that's what a lot of people say. is when they hear something really wise or something really deep, they'll say, "Ah, I understand exactly what it means. I just never had the words for it before." When something makes you feel like that, maybe it's true. Like when someone calls into question a certain thing about your relationship, and you're like, I never thought about it that way before, but I don't like that. Maybe it's true, and maybe you should listen to it. There are certain like questions you can ask yourself, like to kind of try to formalize the process in language. But at the end of the day, I guess most people just follow their sense of sense. Does it make sense to you? Sometimes something wakes you up and it just makes sense. Maybe you should follow it, if only for a while. Yeah, the boxes get infinitely more complex inside, because it's like having menus of menus. You have the menu that describes the food, but the restaurant has multiple menus. So how do you choose which menu to look at? Well, we have a menu that describes what's on each of the menus. And then you can keep going outwards. And then it becomes stupid and ridiculous and pointless at some point. Like what Alan Watts once said, that he said that most books in the library are books of books. They're not books written from direct experience. They're books written about other people's ideas, which those people read in books. They're writing books about other books. And then people write books of those books. And then in the end, we're just reading books of books of books. But he said, but the great books are books about life, from the direct experience. So in some sense, you know, it's good like to attribute knowledge to the last person that you got it from, or the person that inspired you, because you're kind of giving them their due. Like in the past, when someone would attribute a book to the Buddha, it's not necessarily because the Buddha wrote it. It's just that it's the Buddha within them that wrote it. It's the Buddha within them that inspired it, so they attribute it to the Buddha. That's like King Solomon's writings. He probably didn't write all of those things, but people attributed it to him, because they let the spirit of Solomon inspire their writing on that thing, and then they said, well, it's as if Solomon wrote it. So that's kind of, you know, there's value in writing a book about a book in some sense, but the most direct things, you know, if you had to quote who you got your words from, you'd have to spend your whole life attributing people, because you got it from everyone. Like, you got it from so many different people in some sense. Like, maybe you lament that I'm not good enough to remember all the facts and who they came from and where they came from. But in some sense, no one's good enough to remember all of the facts and where they came from and who they came from. Most of the time we don't even know. It's subconscious. So a book with a lot of references is not necessarily superior to a book without a lot of references. A book with a lot of references is called a thesis. It's called a scientific publication. But a book without a lot of references is maybe called fiction. But there are some books that kind of straddle the line between fiction and non-fiction, right? Like Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. It's a philosophy book, but it's also a work of fiction. But in the fact that it's both, he doesn't need to reference things all the time, even though he does reference them within the book. He says, oh, Aristotle said this, and Socrates said this. But he doesn't do that for every single idea he posits, because then the book would be more references than actual book. So, in some sense, a great book is one that's deep, but it doesn't need to be explicit where it got its depth from. Basically, I'm just saying you don't need to attribute everything to everyone all the time, because first of all, you can't. And maybe you can attribute things just to your life. That's fine.
Well, the best knowledge to transmit or wisdom is the one you've experienced.
I think it's the most honest. If you transmit it directly from your experience, or as directly as you can from your experience, it's the most honest way of collecting together valuable knowledge. Because if a lot of people did that, and we find things that appear in a lot of people's different writings, when we know those things are valuable. But if people just wrote books about other people's books, all we know is what those people found valuable. It's nice to have a larger sample size. In every experiment, you'd want as large a sample size as possible. But we reduce the sample size if we only write about other people. So in some sense, maybe everyone should write. Maybe everyone should study and just put things out there into the world of what they think. Because the strongest ideas win in the end. That's it.
This is how your TED Talk ends?
I went too many directions. But I guess that's it for this morning. Even when I think I'm feeling tired or sleepy, I talk for ages.
I know.
Because I still
It's
feel
like a river.
still feel tired because it's still the morning.
Thank you.